Hello and welcome to ThePrint. The International Court of Justice, or the ICJ, recently issued a ruling in South Africa's case against Israel, in which it ordered Israel to prevent acts of genocide in Gaza, but stopped short of calling for an immediate ceasefire. And while the term genocide has been hotly debated amid the Israel-Hamas war, the term domicide has also come to the fore, and domicide refers to the deliberate destruction of homes. Now, with the Gaza war having crossed 100 days with no signs of abating, it's important to talk to experts on the technicalities of international law and perhaps what we can expect going forward. And for that, today we have Professor Balakrishnan Rajagopal, who teaches law and development at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. He also serves as the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. And he is also the founder of the TWAIL network, TWAIL standing for Third World Approaches to International Law. Professor, thank you so much for joining the program today.
Pleasure to be with you.
My first question would be, did you find the ICJ ruling satisfactory?
I think that it's a moral and symbolic victory for the Palestinian case because it actually said that there is a plausible case of genocide. But practically in terms of the results on the ground, especially in terms of ensuring adequate remedies, after all, ultimately, that's what we expect when we approach a court. We don't just expect good words. We expect to get results. In there, I must say that the court left a lot to be desired.
Do you think there's something to be said about a third world country, South Africa, bringing this case to the court?
I think so. I think I was actually very inspired when South Africa brought the case before the court. In fact, I tweeted out saying that it's actually a TWAIL moment in international relations. In fact, to be frank with you, I'd say that the act of South Africa bringing the case to the court is, to me, more significant than the actual ruling of the ICJ itself, in that it expressed a particular desire to see a level playing field in international law and for enforcement of the rules as they already exist. Now, ICJ, of course, reaffirmed many of the obligations that are already incumbent on Israel under the Genocide Convention.
Right.
So it is in that sense that I said that ICJ didn't really break any new ground. The court basically said what is already known by Israel as a treaty party to the Genocide Convention, but it didn't concretely call for anything. The only concrete thing that they called for was that come back and report to us in 1 month. That also, to me, is problematic because we are seeing, we were seeing destruction on an epic scale, and to give 1 whole month for the offending party to come back and report is, to me, to basically accept that between now and 1 month, Israel is entitled to inflict as much damage as it can. That is, I just find it very hard to understand.
Well, let's talk about what you just mentioned, inflicting as much destruction as one possibly can. You are the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. There have been some reports that have come out, for example, from New York Times, which shows that, apart from Israeli airstrikes, Israeli ground forces have also carried out about 33 targeted demolitions in Gaza that have destroyed mosques, schools, a lot of residential sections of residential neighborhoods. What is your analysis of these demolitions? And if you could also explain the concept of domicide to our Indian viewers.
Well, I submitted a report to the UN General Assembly when the Israel-Palestinian conflict had not erupted in this way. Of course, there was a continuing occupation, and there was a very strong evidence that the systematic pattern of home demolitions that Israel has been engaged in for decades in the Palestinian territories already amounted to a crime against humanity, a domicide. But what was really on my mind at that time was the leveling of Ukrainian cities by Russia, including the terrible destruction of Mariupol. So I submitted the report then. During the dialogue with states, most of the Western states very enthusiastically welcomed my report as it confirmed their own critical assessment of what Russia was doing. But then, fast forward to October of, last year, the Hamas attack took place. And what we began seeing confirmed very quickly that domicide, which had already been committed by Israel in a kind of a more passive way because of the vast destruction of homes and the carrying out of home demolitions, as I said, which, by the way, I had already called such acts as domicide in a press release issued with the UN Special Rapporteur on occupied Palestinian territories earlier in 2003. This is well before the outbreak of conflict on October 7th. But after October 7th, when we began seeing what Israel began to do, which is the use of explosives of very widespread area impacts, such as 500-pound, 1,000 and 2,000-pound bombs, indiscriminate firing on neighborhoods, and the leveling of entire swathes of buildings without any distinction whatsoever, it became obvious to me at first that war crimes were being committed, and I call them war crimes. But as the days went on, it became obvious that the destruction was far too widespread or systematic to be simply restricted to war crimes. And therefore, I began to call them crimes against humanity. But as the days have gone by, and as alleged in the South African petition to the ICJ, and when coupled with the genocidal statements of intent that are copious from the Israeli leadership and military authorities, and even everyday soldiers, it's more and more obvious that we may have escalated now from crimes against humanity to acts of genocide themselves. Now, as far as the controlled demolitions that you're referring to are concerned, I must just say that there's simply no provision for it in the Geneva Conventions and the laws that apply to what is called as a law of occupation. That is, when an occupying power is in charge of a territory and a population, in fact, the reverse obligation applies on the occupying power. They're supposed to protect and care for the well-being of the people who live under their occupation, not to engage in systematic destruction of vast, swathes of buildings, not just residential buildings, but mosques. They've destroyed UN schools, for example. A number of other structures have been destroyed. The Palace of Justice has been destroyed, for example, which was the main courthouse in Gaza. And none of these have been destroyed in a way that shows that they were posing an actual ongoing military threat, and therefore could be justified as an act of military necessity under the Geneva Conventions. Typically what happens in these controlled demolitions is that explosives or mines are planted within buildings. Then the Israeli troops draw to a safe distance and someone pulls a trigger and the whole thing blows up. And this is all on video, basically. So I just don't see that these are justified acts of self-defense, as Israel has been claiming, in any meaningful sense. Now, I must also point out that the controlled demolitions that New York Times story referred to are within the territory of Gaza, well beyond what is known as the buffer zone. Now, Israel is also engaged in clearing an entire area up to 1,000 meters along the Israel-Gaza border, which they're calling the buffer zone, and where nothing, no building, no tree, not even a spade of grass can exist, basically. By the way, there are already no-go or no-grow areas, in that if you wander into those areas from the Gaza side, you will be shot. But now they're also physically clearing everything. So there are a lot of problems with the way the controlled demolitions and the arbitrary destruction of buildings and other structures have been taking place in Gaza.
When you submitted your report terming these as crimes against humanity, how was that received?
Well, we didn't receive an official response from the state of Israel. I've also sent a number of letters over the years. I was appointed in May of 2020 as a UN Special Rapporteur. I've written a number of letters about specific allegations, including home demolitions in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, over the years, we have never received a single response from the state of Israel, although Israel also always points to the human rights system as being biased against it. But Israel has an opportunity to put forward the correct information and to defend itself, but it never does that.
Israel's argument has been, especially after it dismissed the ICJ's ruling, Israel's argument has always been that Hamas has always commanded themselves from civilian infrastructure, hospitals, mosques. In fact, we saw a video recently of an Israeli forces raid on a hospital in the West Bank. And after that, Israel sort of, doubled down on its claim, saying that, this is the reason that we go after civilian infrastructure. That's where Hamas hides. How then does this figure in the claims of, domicide or genocide that you had been mentioning?
I think, it's important to remember that Hamas is not an organized military force of an independent state, but is basically a resistance army that springs from an occupied people. And as with the experience of every historical example we can think of, for example, think of the, Kenyans organizing themselves in the 1950s against British colonialism after the Mau Mau rebellion, or the Malays organizing themselves, when British were actually conducting counterinsurgency in the 70s, or the Vietnam War, when the Vietnamese were organizing to repel French and then later American aggression. And we could go down the list. In all those examples, the resistance formations are basically organically, evolved forces that come from the population itself. And it's very hard to sort of draw a distinction between where the resistance forces end and where, the population actually begins. So I don't entirely discount Israel's claim that some members of what we consider to be Hamas population might actually also be Hamas operatives, and they may be conducting hostile operations. But the burden is really on Israel to prove in each and every life that it takes and in each and every building that it destroys that they have actually investigated and they have found more than credible evidence that such individuals and such facilities are actually used for military purposes, and therefore military necessity gives them a right under the Geneva Conventions to take action. Now, we have not seen any such evidence being put forward. For example, in the case of the hospital attack that you referred to, in fact, I would say the evidence shows the reverse, that Israeli forces disguise themselves as doctors, basically, and other civilian personnel, to go in and then use guns to assassinate the people that they claim are Hamas. Now, when you actually, for an occupying force to actually operate without wearing a uniform is already a prima facie violation of the provisions of the Geneva Conventions. So it's Israel that's violating Geneva Conventions here. Now, if it is true that such individuals are members of Hamas, then the burden is really on Israel to prove it. But even then, I would say, even if there is evidence that some facilities may be double purposed as, military facilities, or that some individuals may be, say, moonlighting for Hamas while they do other things, etc. Even then, in fact, conducting military operations that actually are systematic or widespread, or especially concerningly, if they are carried out with a genocidal intent to, for example, make the place uninhabitable, or to prevent the return of the population, or to wipe out the people entirely from that area, then all such acts are already criminal. Israel has no defense against any of that.
Just for our viewers, the West Bank hospital raid I was talking about happened earlier this week. There were Israeli forces, as Professor mentioned, dressed up as doctors, as women, carrying rifles and going through corridors. The 3 men that were killed were militants. Hamas said one of them was part of its group, and the Islamic Jihad, which is also an ally of Hamas, said 2 of the other men were part of its group. But professors, let's move a little bit towards what I find quite interesting, which is that this is not the only war that's going on the world stage. There are, of course, many, but there's also been the Ukraine war that Russia has waged against Ukraine. And it's quite interesting to see both of these wars on the world stage, because the Western world has been accused of double standards sometimes. Recently, the EU's Political Affairs Committee, PACE, said that frozen Russian assets should be transferred to a new fund to rebuild Ukraine. Could one argue under international law, since you are a domain expert, that the same applies to Israel?
Well, actually, I kind of tweeted about this same issue when I saw it. I mean, just as a matter of logic, treating apples and apples as, basically apples are apples, no matter where they are. Sure, I don't see any reason why Israeli assets cannot be frozen and used for the rebuilding of Gaza, because the cost of rebuilding is going to be gargantuan. Just take, for example, the Ukraine destruction by Russia. After an initial assessment, the World Bank estimated that the cost of rebuilding Ukraine, and this is, by the way, was assessing 2 years of conflict. So the conflict is still ongoing, as you know. Just this month and in December, Russia has been bombing Ukraine again. But even an earlier assessment found that the estimate would be about $411 billion. And Mariupol alone, the estimate is that it will cost about $14 billion to rebuild Mariupol. And the rebuilding, by the way, will take about 10 years. This, by the way, is in line with the rebuilding of cities after World War II. When Rotterdam was utterly destroyed by German bombing, it took decades to rebuild Rotterdam. And bottomless amounts of funds were made available through the Marshall Plan for that. And by the way, this was in the most propitious circumstances where there was no more fighting, there was no more war. There was generally a condition of peace in Europe. And then it took them 2 decades to rebuild it. So we are talking about a very long-term process. So make no doubt about it, Gaza has to be rebuilt because it is the land of the Palestinian people. And it's going to take a very long time, and someone's going to have to pay for it and to stay engaged. And we need peace to prevail for reconstruction to happen. And I've called on Israel and the countries that provided political and military support to Israel so far, starting with the United States, to be responsible financially and politically for the rebuilding of Palestine as a state, including Gaza. And as far as the use of the Israeli assets is concerned, I was making a rhetorical point that if you can do it with Russia, why not do it with Israel? But I must say that purely as a matter of international law, there are some problems and concerns if we assert that rule too bluntly because of a simple fact. The fact is that most of the assets of many countries are actually tied up in, shall we say, dominant financial institutions of the world. And they happen to be located in London and New York. They are not located in Addis Ababa. They're not located in Rio de Janeiro, and certainly not in New Delhi. And which also means that the only countries actually that can take any measures to enforce such sanctions or to freeze the assets would again be the same countries that caused the destruction in the first place, in the case of Israel and Gaza. So there is a problem in calling, for example, the fox to guard the chicken coop in a way. So we have to be very careful not to assert that as a general rule politically, but even legally. I know that there is quite a lot of disagreement among international lawyers about whether an effort to seize the sovereign assets of a country to settle claims that in a unilateral manner by third parties is actually consistent with international law more broadly. So it's a controversial proposition what they're doing with Russia. And if anyone dares to try to do it with Israel, I'd be curious to see if anyone even tries. But if they do, it's going to be equally controversial as well.
So you're saying the logic applies, but as far as international law goes, you got to be careful setting a precedent.
That's right. And well, precedent has already been set. The most recent precedent was in the case of Iraq after the destruction of Kuwait, for example, and the freezing of Iraqi assets. Iran is another example. Iranian assets have been frozen by the United States and used for all kinds of other claims. So there are already examples. By the way, all of them are controversial as well. So and then now they talk about Russia. So I just want to say that we have a unipolar or lopsided system of world order. In that world order, where some countries, have disproportionate amount of power and ability to take action, it's kind of dangerous to call on rules to be applied without being sensitive to context.
Well, Professor, I won't take any more of your time. Thank you so much for taking out the time of your busy schedule to explain a lot of important technicalities of international law, not just to me, but to our viewers. I found it quite helpful, and I hope our viewers at home do as well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.